you a little bit of the Resilience Fund. The Resilience Fund was launched in 2019 to support community responses to organized crime. And what do we mean by community responses? The real resilience, the first responders who are on the grounds of criminal governance, conflict, and violence, who are enabling innovative responses, commonly, often risking their lives. But at the roots of all this work, we really find a lot of inspiration in their responses, in their resilience. And that's why I'm so excited to be here today. In 2019, when we conceived the Resilience Fund, we also thought about a way to do something for individuals, leaders in their communities, to bring them together and perhaps collaborate, share stories, lessons learned. So we launched the Resilience Fellowship, and each year we launch a call for applications. We get hundreds of good proposals from all over the world, and we select 10 fellows around different topics. This year was human rights, and for the first time we got together our fellows in Vienna. And so I had the honor to meet the panelists who are joining us today. I had the honor to meet them in person, so I can assure you this is going to be a great panel. And the idea of this fellowship is to collaborate, and one of the main issues we discussed in Vienna, and we have been discussing on our follow-up dialogues, has been around youth. It's so hard to find hope in the work we do. It's so hard to find hope when we're talking about organized crime, but youth is definitely one of those cracks where the light can come in, and that's why I'm so happy to be here today. So I'm going to start introducing you to set the mood and tell us about organized crime and the relationship with human rights, from different kind of angles. Specifically, when we're talking about international law, I have the honor to introduce you to my colleague, Ana Paula Oliveira. She's an analyst from the Global Initiative, focusing on assassinations, disappearances, and other forms of violence in the context of illicit economies, as well as human rights, law, and policy. She's a Brazilian qualified lawyer and also in international law by the Graduate Institute in Geneva. Welcome, Ana Paula.
Thank you very much, Syria, for giving me the floor. And it's an honor and a pleasure to share this panel with our Resilience Fund grantees and fellows. So I would start by sharing my screen, and I hope you can all see it. Let's see. It's always a bit of a nerve-wracking moment when we start sharing the screen. So yes, as I said, it's a really pleasure to be here. And my role in this roundtable discussion is to kick off the conversation on the intersection between human rights and organized crime. And I'm going to do this by presenting some of the highlights of this report that you can see in the screen. 4 reasons why organized crime is a human rights issue. I hope you can see my screen correctly. Please like to me if
yes,
that's the case. Yes, so before I think going into the findings of the report, I would like to maybe go back a little bit and discuss why we decided to do this policy brief, why we decided to do this project, and the methodology that we use to underpin some of the results that I'm going to present. So in terms of object, the idea behind this policy brief is highlight areas where we think the conversation could be strengthened between human rights and organized crime issues. And how we do that, and we do that with using data collected in the projects conducted by the Resilience Fund from 2019 until September 2023. We collected the data, and I'm going to share the next slide. As you can see, the distribution of the data in this graph. But so we selected the more than 200 projects, and we are categorized them according to the areas of work of our grantees, and as well as the groups of people that they contribute to that community. And this data was then analyzed against 2 main human rights instruments, so the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights. And with this, we produced a first document that was then subject to discussion, as Syria mentioned, in the week that we had the pleasure to be together in person and discuss some of this issue. And I have to say that this is not a full account of all human rights issues deriving from organized crime, because that would be impossible. Two areas that are very broad. We have many human rights issues, as well as organized crime can be defined in so many ways. But these 4 areas that I'm going to discuss today, with particularly focusing on the rights that affect youth, are important to us based on the Resilience Fund experience, as I said. And we hope that with this policy brief, we can initiate some discussions around the incredible challenges posed by organized crime to state obligations to fulfill and protect and prevent human rights. So that being said, in this slide are the 4 areas that emerged from this policy brief. And something I forgot to mention the beginning of the talk, but this policy brief is being launched tomorrow in the Global Initiative's website. So today is a sneak peek of what you can access tomorrow. So the first area is the intersection between organized crime violence and states' ability to protect civil and political rights. At the first sight, this could be seen as something taken for granted, but as we moved forward in our discussions with grantees, with fellows, amongst ourselves, is that actually is way more than just connecting violence to human rights. There are 2 areas that we think need further recognition. First, how states could be complicity to this violence as well, and how this violence affects differently the most marginalized communities that are exposed to organized crime. And we are talking here about minority groups, structured vulnerable groups. We are talking here about gender-related violence. And obviously violations to the right to life, but also violations to political participation, freedom of expression, non-discrimination. Children's vulnerability to violence can be increased in organized crime control settings, including violence of sexual nature. So GI's research has highlighted how contexts of forced marriage had put girls subject to abuse and other human rights violations. And we have highlighted grantees working on gender issues, in particular the LGBTI community, and the connection between violation of rights as well in this policy brief. I won't go in detail because we're going to hear more during the panel today. The second area where I think it's important to highlight is the connection between the fulfillment of economic and social cultural rights in the face of organized crime. I think here we are talking about situations of criminal governance, as Syria mentioned in the beginning of the talk. There are reinforcing ways where economic and social rights and organized crime are connected. And so this comes, for example, from resources allocated to combat organized crime. They are being diverted from the fulfillment of economic and social rights. We are talking as well, for example, of proceeds of economic activity from corruption, for example, illicit financial flows that could be better tapped into addressing socioeconomic needs. This is an area of research that we think could be further explored. But the whole idea here is that by not providing to the maximum extent of the state's capacity those rights, there is a societal gap that is increased and exploited by criminal governance and criminal groups. So the lack of access to social service, housing, food opens the opportunity for organized crime exploit, and particularly exploit the young people. I'm sure both of my co-panelists today will have a lot more to add in this particular setting, but I think 4 things that I think are the main takeaways from this report in this regard is that contexts of criminal governance are commonly associated to economic and social rights, but not necessarily included in these discussions. Youth are particularly targeted by criminal groups in that context because they present an alternative livelihood in the face of lack of opportunity that youth normally face. So lack of access to social service, health, education, work, giving chance to youth to be engaged in other forms. as they see it as the only way forward. It's always important to bear in mind that those rights that we are talking about here, right to health, how to education, to work, are rights that are provided by international human rights instruments, including the Convention on Rights of Children. And lastly, what I wanted to highlight as well, that most of the projects that we looked into, this second point of the policy brief, were projects where had a common denominator, which is very beautiful, which is providing opportunities to young people, to children, into developing of skills that keep them away from gang and non-state armed groups cooptation. So that leads to the third area that I would like to highlight, which is the repressive state responses to organized crime, which can lead to several human rights abuse. And we know that youth, particularly from certain minority groups or Afro-descendant youth, can be especially targeted to some of policies responding to organized crime. And this is an area that we should always reinforce, that needs further discussion. And finally, we talked in this policy brief about victims and survivors of organized crime and their invisibility in terms of access to justice and right to redress. And I think if we want to convey a good message that we want to promote the rights of children and the rights of youth to a better future, we have to talk about access to justice. So I'll stop here and give the floor to my next co-panelist, and just wanted to bring about these findings to initiate our roundtable. Thanks again, Syria.
Thank you, Ana Paula. Before I introduce our next panelist, I want to welcome those of you who have just joined. I see more people joining in, and we're talking today about the intersection between human rights and organized crime, because believe it or not, it's still a challenge to connect these two work streams. And it's not just how we conceive it in international law. As you heard by Ana Paula, there's also the need for greater understanding to see where the intersection of the responsibility of states and the responsibility of non-state actors is in the violations of human rights. Certainly it's a very interesting issue, but when we're talking about theory, the main thing is to link it with what is happening on the ground. And that's what we're trying to do in the Resilience Fund, is really understand the dynamics of organized crime at the local level and connect them to the multilateral policy dialogue. Some of the work that Ana Paula does in Vienna, for example, with the GI's global policy team. But today I want to introduce you a great activist from Colombia. Her name is Luisa Fernanda Riascos Gamboa. She's the director and co-founder of GI-TOC Foundation, focusing on victims of gender-based violence and human rights violations. And she's working through trainings and cultural projects, promoting social cohesion and community engagement in places where there's absolute criminal governance in the Pacific side of Colombia. And Luisa is a fellow this year of the Human Rights Resilience Fellowship, and her project focuses on at-risk youth in her region, and she's providing them with safe spaces to learn and engage with their creative talent. They organize workshops on writing, painting, photography, and they use these tools to share knowledge on gender-based violence, work on prevention protocols, and raise awareness about human rights violations and criminal governance in Colombia. Thank you, Luisa, and welcome. Luisa's connection is a bit slow, so she won't have her camera on, so bear with us, but we cannot hear you, Luisa. Can you please check your mic again?
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes, welcome. Please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I apologize for the delay. I was already facing one of the challenges of living in a rural area, which is the connection. Before I start, I want to thank all the people that made this panel possible and the Global Initiative team for inviting me and considering my experience to represent the Colombian rural youth. Today, I'm going to talk about organized crime, the impact of rights and youth in rural areas. I'm going to try to share a presentation. I hope the signal is, do you see the presentation?
Not yet, but it's sharing. Yeah.
Can you see the presentation?
I don't see it yet. It says screen sharing. Let's see if it's loading. The other option is, Luisa, you go ahead and yeah, we'll try to see if one of our colleagues in the organizing team can help us sharing the screen. But for now, you know, maybe we can start with Stephen and then get your presentation run by somebody from the team. Would that be okay, Luisa?
Yeah, I'm sorry, my signal is so bad.
Perfect. Don't worry about it. That's why we have a great, competent team of the Global Initiative handling all the issues of going live in an international event such as this. So I'm going to go now to Stephen. He's also another wonderful fellow who joined us in Vienna this year to talk about organized crime and human rights, who also has a great interest on working with at-risk youth. Stephen is a queer activist in Kenya, advancing equality and not discrimination by deconstructing internalized and structural homophobia and anti-gender practices. His mission is to create gender diverse platforms, spaces, and opportunities that embody respect for human rights and human dignity. During his fellowship, he's been addressing targeted violence against the LGBTQ+ communities that have been pushed into human trafficking. And he has contributing to a platform addressing human trafficking of LGBTQ people, including work with the Kenyan National Commission on Human Rights, the Directorate of Criminal Investigations in Kenya, and the Counter-Trafficking Directorate of the National Police, and other queer-led civil society organizations in his country. Welcome again, Stephen, and tell us more about your work.
When the anti-homosexuality bill was passed in Uganda, I feared for my life and wanted to run away from my country. I was extremely scared knowing that the police could come for me at any moment. Coming from a small town in Uganda known as Mukono, some of my relatives had threatened me that they would out me for my sexuality to be corrected. Being very scared, I left one morning without knowing where I was going. I just wanted to be far away from home. One of my friends introduced me to this gentleman who promised to help me get asylum through Kenya's Kakuma refugee camp. I was super excited that my safety was now guaranteed. Little did I know that this was the start to a very tough journey. He helped me cross the Busia border as he had connections with the border control. I was not asked for any document. I was just given a free pass. He told me that there are no restrictions to cross the Kenyan border. He then helped me get a place to sleep for the day around Kakamega town. Later on, I came to realize that it was an Airbnb which he had rented. The following day, around 3 a.m., he came while I was still asleep. He was in the company of 3 other guys and a driver. I could not even tell the number plate as it was still dark, and he insisted that I had. What I can remember though is that it was a black van, the exact type used as ambulances. I got in at the back and realized that it had beddings and some light stands. I did not know that this would be my home for a very long time. We drove for hours and could not even tell where we were. I remember the van coming to a stop along some isolated tarmac road. Someone got off and got on a motorbike. We again drove for around an hour or so, when again the van stopped. All this while, they were just busy on their phones. I had no phone myself since I had left it at the Airbnb while in a hurry to leave. The van's door was open and I asked where my friend was. That was when I was met with the harsh reality that I had been sold off to the 3 guys. They came out clear and told me that they meant no harm and that if I cooperate, then they will guarantee my safety. All this while I was literally shaking. I was scared and weak. I asked them what they wanted, and they told me that they are compiling gay pornography for sale and that I was to be part of it, or they would cut out my kidney and heart for sale, as there was a huge demand in the country for the organs. My body became weak, my voice trembled, tears deserted me, then I gambled with the thought of death. The same reason I ran away from Uganda was the same reason I was now being trafficked for sex purposes. I was dead inside. I still think I am. I had to choose the pornography option to save my life. I slept with men in turns for several days while the cameras were on. I was barely eating and became so weak and tired. I don't know how far those videos have reached, but what I know is that I'm dead on the inside. I need help. Please help me.
Thank you for finding time to watch that video. Thank you so much to the GI team for inviting me to be part of this panel, to just share the context to exist in and the intersections between organized crime and queer rights. Just like the videos ended, I need help, and please help me. That is the narrative that keeps on ringing in the hearts and minds of most queer activists who are proactively at the forefront to counter organized crime on a daily basis. To give a practical context, early this year, the Kenyan Supreme Court did affirm their position in terms of the freedom of association of LGBTQ plus persons. And further to that, there's been a lot of misconstrued narratives by, of course, the opposition that this meant that the Supreme Court had legalized same-sex marriage in the country. That misconception led to a rise of the anti-LGBTQ movement under the pretense of protests and demonstrations, which ideally exposed the LGBTQ plus community in Kenya to deliberate targeting and profiling by the organized gangs who are adequately resourced by the opposition. We've seen, and we have statistics, for instance, between January to date, as we are having this live conference, we've managed 214 cases of LGBTQ plus persons who've been trafficked through the porous borders of Kenya. Kenya is geographically located to have actually three main extreme borders. That is the Kenyan border, the Ugandan border, and the Somalian border. And these borders have been kind of porous to an extent that we've had deliberate trafficking in person, we've had deliberate smuggling of immigrants through these porous borders into the country and outside the country, in the pretense of offering amnesty or offering immunity or offering asylum to those queer persons who are in desperate need of safety and security. All these 214, close to 80% of them have fallen victims of deliberate targeting. Just like the video has depicted, some of the end product of this trafficking has been sextortion. Sextortion in the context that there's a growing demand for gay pornography, and most of the queer persons fall short of these, like fall in the hands of gay producers, gay porn producers, who then instill fear on them that the alternative offer is for them to get their organs amputated for sale. So that is also organ sale or organ trafficking. That is a bigger context of organized crime that is being facilitated by the ongoing anti-LGBTQ plus legislation in Eastern Africa. Kenya and Uganda and also and Tanzania celebrate and enjoy an open East African market policy. This policy enables the citizens from different countries of Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania to trade. But then in the context of trade, it has led to a deliberate exposure, or rather the opening up of the border for purposes of illicit trade. And illicit trade in the context of, one, illicit trade in terms of infiltration of illicit goods, infiltration of immigrants, in the context of offering solutions in terms of transition through the Kakuma and Dadaab camps as platforms for getting asylum outside the country. And a larger percentage of the 214 have been our family from Uganda, because Uganda currently have legislated the Anti-Homosexuality Act of 2023. So most of those who've been trafficked or smuggled into the country through the Busia border have been promised a solution in terms of short stay, have been promised solution in terms of getting green cards or visas to get asylum outside the country. Now, the end product is what you've seen as a case study of the struggles that the queer persons face. Now, internally in Kenya, and also is something that we've seen also happening in Tanzania and other parts of the country, other parts of Africa, is the anti-LGBTQ plus protests. Now, the anti-LGBTQ plus protests has been a tool that has been used, that is currently being used to weaponize sexuality against the LGBTQ plus person. Why am I saying this? It's in public domain, and also it's in press statements, news bulletins, that the religious settings and the cultural settings have come up vibrantly to oppose the LGBTQ agenda, while this is a narrative being advanced by the far-right fundamentalists, and of course by the enablers. The end product of this status quo is to create a confusion and also to create a toxic space within which there cannot be conversations that are affirming of the LGBTQ plus rights, but rather spaces that enable the opposition to capitalize on and also invite the organized gangs to leverage in that space to infringe on the rights of the queer persons in the pretense of offering conversion therapy. Now, conversion therapy as its ultimate end, one, we have mental health struggles, we have mental health burdens, economic struggles, we have social struggles because of the gag and the silencing, and of course, the weaponization that is being facilitated by these organized gangs, which are largely resourced, has led to also queer persons getting back into closets. And there's nothing as dangerous as being in a closet. It denies you your fundamental rights and freedoms as a person, and also kind of isolates you from the larger development agenda. We are currently, and based on my Resilience Fellowship project, we are currently developing an anthology of stories, of lived reality stories of queer persons who have faced real-time oppression and intimidation by the organized criminal gangs. And part of it speaks to key findings around, number one, we're talking about issues around social seclusion. We're talking about issues around infringement on rights. We're talking about issues around deliberate outing and profiling. We're talking about issues around gagging and silencing the voices of queer persons. Now, what is human rights? If you cannot openly speak what is human rights, if you cannot live in your authentic form of self, what is human rights if you're constantly looking at your back because you're being targeted by people who are strongly armed against you, armed and not only armed, but equally hugely resourced against you? Is it a crime to live your authentic life? It's still a question that I leave for us to deliberate about. Thank you, Sue.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for articulating the vulnerabilities of this particular community to organized crime. Because, of course, when we're talking about people whose basic right to exist is denied by the state, we put them in a situation where if you combine that with criminal governance, with the violence of organized crime, of course, they become the most vulnerable, especially when we're talking about minors. And as we have seen, and this is not only in Kenya, but the vulnerability of minors to human trafficking for sexual exploitation is, of course, a heightened, where there's situations where there's abandonment, where youth becomes also vulnerable to the influence of criminal gangs at a young age. But this is all very interesting. And of course, we've been hearing in the news the cases of Uganda and Kenya, and just what does that mean for international organized crime, for the international human trafficking network? Is very interesting. So thank you for that, Stephen. And if the audience has any questions for Stephen or any of our panelists speaking today, please put them in the chat. We can address them at the end, or they can answer to you right away. But I invite you to comment, to ask questions, and be part of this dialogue with us, with these amazing fellows joining us today. I think Luisa Fernanda has joined a better connection already, and one of our colleagues has her presentation. So please welcome Luisa from Colombia, again, working with youth, the topic we're discussing today in the context of human rights and organized crime. Welcome again, Luisa.
Thank you so much, Syria. And apologize, I was facing one of the challenges that rural youth we have, that is the connection to internet. So that was what's happening. Before I start, I want to thank to all the people that made this panel possible, to the Global Initiative team for inviting me and considering my experience to represent the Colombian rural youth, specifically the Pacific Coast, where I'm from. So today I'm going to talk about organized crime impact on the right of youth in rural areas in Colombia. So next page, please. So first I'm going to explain where I'm from. I'm from Huanchaco, Buenaventura. It's a rural area that is located in Bahia Málaga, 45 minutes in motorboat from the main city, Buenaventura. The only way to get there is by a motorboat. So Bahia Málaga is a territory that, due to its strategic geographic location and its different river routes, constitutes a corridor for the trafficking and micro-traffic of arms and drugs, making drug trafficking one of the socioeconomic dynamics in the territories. In Colombia, the rural areas are historically the most affected by the presence of armed groups, actors, and violence. Next page, please. And this is because of the lack of education, the lack of access to basic services, the lack of job opportunities that have become the perfect recipe for perpetrating and strengthening organized crime. Likewise, working conditions for rural youth are very precarious. The sources of work are related to agricultural activities, tourism, which in many cases are characterized by a very low wages and irregular labor rights, which are the factors that encourage their involvement in illegal activities. And also the consequences of environmental damage from illegal mining, climate change, pollution of the sea, scarce drinking water, and soil degradation, among others, are other problems that we as a youth face every day. Next page, please. So rural youth have been historically invisibilized in Colombia. According to the last national census, 45.6% of the people living in these rural areas are in condition of multidimensional poverty, a percentage that rises to
63.8% when it's referring to poverty ethnic groups and population displaced by organized crime. And when I talk about ethnic groups, I'm referring to Afro communities and indigenous communities. Next, please. So with this, more than 20% of rural children and adolescents between 5 and 16 years of age do not attend school, a percentage that increased to 73.7% between 18 and 24 years of which means half of rural children, adolescents, and young people do not go beyond primary school here in Colombia. Next, please. So when we are referring about organized crime, in 2022, approximately 207,000 minors were victims of conflicts between Colombia states and our groups by the FARC dissidents, ELN, Clan de Golfo, and other armed structures, which is an increase to 11.5% with respect of 2021. So next, please. So today, the exponential growth of organized crime in regions such as Colombian, Caribbean, and the Pacific coast, where is manifested by violence associated with drug trafficking, mostly sponsored by the Clan del Golfo, that is the structure that we have here in my community, and others organizations. So most of the members of these, next please, most of the members of these urban groups are adolescents and youth, and it's because they are looking for opportunities. They are looking to break the poverty cycle. So in Colombia, at least 12.35% of adolescents and youth have belonged to a criminal gang. So now, next please, when we talk about human rights, we can see that the violation of human rights and infraction of international humanitarian law against Colombian children, adolescents, and youth in decades of conflicts that haven't ended is very serious. And when we talk, next please, when we talk about rural women, the vulnerability is worse, and this is because sexism and territorial violence. For example, here in my community, one of the tactics to control the territories for the organized crimes is to get involved with a girl and the adolescents of a women. So with that, they control the family and they can control the territory. So here in the Pacific coast and other rural areas, the violence is getting that normalized that that's not seen as a child prostitution. It seems like a normal behavior where people are just looking for opportunities, are looking for security, and that's the way they are managing with the context that they have. And this gets worse because in Colombia, where I'm from, we have the highest rates of pregnancies, and that 7% of women between age of 15 and 19 years of age do not have access to methods and to sexual and reproductive health. So as I have 5 minutes, we can go forward, and I'm going to explain what I'm doing as we can go forward. The other one. So in Colombia, children and adolescents who grow up in violent environments are used by criminal groups lose the opportunity for personal and social development, lose the ability or the possibility to dream a future different than organized crime. So next, please. The other one, please. So what I'm doing as a young rural woman, with right now, I'm executing a project with the Resilient Fund that is focused on creating safe spaces through art for children, adolescents, and teenagers, where they can dream other narrative or their lives. We use art, photography, writing as a tool to resignifies this context to as a tool where they can dream to other future. Right now, we have 20 young people that are participating in our workshops, and we have 5 of them that are already replicating with the way they have learned. Next, you can see in the other one some pictures about what we are doing. One of the results of this project is going to be a short film where they are going to narrate how they see the territory, what they believe is violence, what they want for their future. And we are going to have a trip to one of the main cities here in Colombia, that is Cali, where we are going to launch art exposition. We can see it in the other page. We are going to show all the things that they have done all this year with us, all the photographies, and also the short film that is being made by them. So yeah, that's what we are doing. I do believe that education is the tool. You can put the other ones. Is the tool for construct peace environments. Children's what they need is a place where they can dream, where they can become their life projects come true. What I believe is the economic, social, and political development of rural communities depends of the quality of the education that we get as a rural young. So only through education will be possible to overcome violence and advance in the development of society. And this has to be done with a differential approach that understands the context of rural youth and with a restorative justice approach that can heal the harm that they have done in our communities. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Luisa. Your presentation is really inspiring. I totally relate to your work. I am from Mexico. I am from Sinaloa, and I see the importance of providing these alternative narratives for youth when the narco culture, when the criminal culture becomes mainstream. It is important to keep the stories, the poetry, the music, the photography alive, and keep working with youth. So thank you very much. You were talking at the beginning of your talk that communications is one of those challenges. Yes, I want to tell our audience that for these fellows to be here is a great effort, not only because it is difficult to connect through the internet sometimes working in the territories that they work, but also because of security challenges. People joining us today and the other fellows are constantly the victims of harassment online, smear campaigns, actual physical attacks and threats, not only to themselves, but also to their families. The work that they do in the Resilience Fund is extremely delicate. And of course, through the implementation of their grant, the Resilience Fund security is one of the issues we work with our fellows. But I don't want to underestimate and go without recognizing that the work they do with youth comes at a really big price. Human rights defenders all over the world are increasingly at risk. So I really want to thank you again today for being with us. And I want to thank again our next guest. Jax Mujindo is also a Resilience Fellow this year, and he's a lecturer at the Université Oficial de Rwenzori in the Department of International Relations in Butembo in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He's a PhD student at the Department of Diplomacy and International Students at the University of Nairobi in Kenya. He has been coordinating the Amani Kwetu program that connects local communities to the region's security stakeholders such as army and peacekeepers to protect civilians in conflict-affected zones. Also, during his fellowship, Jax is working with orphanages in border areas and criminal hotspots in Beni, Kasindi, and Butembo to prevent the recruitment of criminal organizations and to prevent orphans to become trafficked for other purposes. He's working on an information system to consolidate the needs of orphans, to follow up on adoption practices, and protect them from human trafficking. Thank you so much, Jax, for your work and for being here today.
Thank you so much, Syria, for your kind words, and thank you for that introduction. I thank also my colleagues who have done amazing presentation. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you, GI-TOC, for organizing this session. Actually, today I decided to tackle a very specific question. how does organized crime affect young people's rights in conflict zones? As it was said, I am based in North Kivu, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and North Kivu is one of the provinces that are the most affected by conflicts in Democratic Republic of the Congo. So it's important to note that conflict and crime in countries like DRC feed on violence to create a chaotic context that reduces the presence of and the efficiency of the state, including the army, the police, the intelligence, and jeopardize the rule of law. So because of conflict, it becomes difficult to make a clear distinction between armed groups with a political agenda, lobby groups that try to defend the rights of local communities when the state cannot intervene, and sometimes use violence to achieve their goals, and criminal organizations that take advantage of the context to traffic minerals, small weapons, environmental products, and persons. In this context of conflict, armed groups, lobby groups, criminal organizations use the youth as their labor to achieve their goals, and they're operating in the same context. So the rule 20 to 80% ratio applies. What does it mean? It means that only 20% of their leaders are under 25, but 80% of their members are under 25. The implication is that those who are at the forefront of their activities die in their violence-fed operations. Those who are arrested and prosecuted, those who have no future outside violence, are young people. But when political arrangements are made to end violence, young people will not benefit from amnesty arrangements, promotion into security forces, financial benefits, and political positions. So I will give an example. DRC has experienced conflicts for at least 3 decades. When the war started in 1996, warlords massively recruited young people and children under 15. They were called the Kadogo. So these are children who are born energetic, carefree, and they are the ones who are used to commit the most horrible war crimes between 1998 and 2003. However, when negotiations took place to reunify the country, warlords decided to send these youths back to the communities through the demobilization and reinsertion programs. These are youths who are used to violence, traumatized by what they used to do, could not live a normal life without drugs, whose education was disrupted and could not learn normally. They had no skill other than violence and killing. Therefore, no one could employ them, and they were discriminated against in their communities, rejected by their families that could not stand their violent behavior. Consequently, they had to look for options where they can fit. So crime and violence were the only 2 options available. So many small armed groups in courts rose in the eastern part of DRC from 2003. They were calling themselves armed groups to have a certain viability, but the majority was constituted of criminal organizations involved in drug trafficking, in mineral trafficking, in small arms trafficking, and human trafficking. Some of their leaders who found their ways in the political sphere or in the security system continued to protect these criminal networks that were turned into armed groups when it was appropriate and could be turned back to criminal activities once abandoned by the politicians or security officers who used to use they wanted to get. So what is the implication of all that? Youths are victims of crime and conflicts. Their rights to life, to good health, and to education are deprived in the process. They are turned into violence and crime monsters. A few find their ways in prisons, but many are those who die in the process. For example, 4 out of 5 people who die in violent confrontations between security forces and armed groups or criminal organizations are male and are estimated to be under 30. The inherent right to life and physical integrity of youths is the most infringed in a context where conflict and crime cohabitate. Now, when conflict and crime cohabitate, Local communities who lose their livelihoods and lives in the process get frustrated, accusing the state, especially the security forces, the army, the police, and stakeholders of abandonment. We've heard of late of demonstrations against the UN peacekeeping mission in the country because local communities, they were saying that they are not doing enough to protect them. The street becomes the only option to voice their anger. And again, the rule of 20 to 80% ratio applies here. What does it mean? 20% of the demonstrators are leaders who are not young. Most of the time, they are politicians, civil society leaders, community leaders. They organize demonstrations, strategize, and all. And the remaining 80% that will be sent to the streets to demonstrate and face the army and the police are youths. They will be the ones to be shot dead, to be arrested and kept in detention without trial, to suffer injuries, and so on. At times, criminal organizations infiltrate the same demonstrations to increase the chaos and recruit among the youths. We saw this last year during the anti-UN demonstrations in North Kivu, Eastern DRC. In conclusion, conflict and crime create an unending circle of violence and human rights violations. At first, youths are victims, but they end up identifying with the perpetrators. So those who plan all this and benefit from it use young people whose vulnerability has increased because of conflicts to gain from violence and crime. These are young people who come from poor communities, who lost their parents at a very young age, who did not have proper education because of either poverty or war, who do not have skills and future outside violence and crime, which give them some power and a sense of identity. So at the end of the day, they will be the one to lose their lives, and the cycle continues. So what do we do now in this particular context? Thanks to the support I've received for GI-TOC under the Resilience Fellowship, we do a lot of advocacy. We talk to the communities where these young people come from and discuss the issues that send them in the hands of armed groups and criminal organizations. And when possible, we involve security actors and create a direct link to the community so that security issues can be addressed without violence. And we have a unique approach to this. In a conflict area, security is a very sensitive topic. So we make sure the security stakeholders own the process. When they are involved, they take credit of it. For us, we focus on the impact and we make sure that at least we can limit violence. And by limiting violence, we limit the possibility for criminal organizations to recruit the youth. Also, we use the humanitarian and development hands to tackle organized crime and human rights related issues, because it's not easy in our context to make a distinction between a victim and a perpetrator when talking to stakeholders in a conflict zone. Sometimes when you are in the field, you want to talk about organized crime and human rights to the community, you may find yourself in the middle of the leaders of a criminal organizations who pretend to be part of that particular community. That's why we come as humanitarian. Then through the humanitarian projects, we start those tough discussions on organized crime and human rights. So we'll use, for example, an environmental project to unlock hard talks on small weapons trafficking in mining areas, and a child protection project like the one we have to discuss issues around the recruitment of youths by criminal organizations. We are offering psychosocial, legal, medical, and education support to children in orphanages in the region where we operate to ensure these most vulnerable youths who lost their parents to violence and crime are de-traumatized and are given options for a better future. So we are implementing an information system that we developed to promote and protect their rights and save them from crimes like trafficking in persons, because in conflict areas, not every orphanage is a safe place for children. There are some actors who call themselves humanitarian actors, local humanitarian actors. They will start a children's home, but when you come check into what is happening, you realize that it's not an orphanage, it's something else. So we have discovered a lot, but we can only say there is light at the end of the tunnel, and we are on the right path to transform youths from victims to champions and not perpetrator. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jags, and really thank you to all of our fellows and to our audience as well. I see we have one comment and one question. Thank you, Robert Bacon. Criminal activity produces effects that go beyond the criminal act and the organization. Yes, there are secondary, tertiary order of effects that have nefarious consequences. And no doubt, and I think that's why it's important to speak about youth when we're talking about human rights and organized crime. And I get why the fellows of this year's fellowship identified youth as a priority issue, because really if to address the consequences, to address organized crime, we're not doing any work with youth, we might as well wrap up our stuff and leave. I think there's no other option. It sounds like a cliche and sounds obvious, but we really must address the problem with the youngest, and education is definitely key. And as you say, and Moisan, I'm going to read your question because you said the need for education was identified as key. However, the type and quality of education, as well as tailored curriculums and capable teachers are also a must. Without all these, education alone is ineffective. How is this challenge addressed, especially to meet the realities and needs of the job market and avoid lives in crime? I think that is a super interesting question. What to do? We all talk about education, but we know that the quality of education, not only in your communities, but even in you can say countries of the North are struggling with the quality of their education as well. There's a big conversation on the change of paradigm in education right now, but Luisa, I will ask you first and then maybe ask you about these, Jax and Stephen, but what do you think of this question? Do you have any answer? What to do when we know the quality of education is compromised?
Yeah, in fact, this question is very accurate because that's a problem that we are facing here in Colombia. Even though we have the peace agreement in 2016, and even though the government has signed the effort of, improve the quality of the education here in the rural areas, that hasn't been done yet. From GI-TOC, what we have done is to make an agreement with the school here in my community, and we are helping them to review the curriculums. We also have trained the teachers in gender-based violence. We talk all the time with the psychologists and with the psychology in the community, and we'll see strategies to, overcome the problem, to motivate young people here that are working with us. For example, the trip that we are going to have to Cali, we are going to have one professor that is coming with us. So we are trying to make all these alliance and connections, also knocking doors, going to other government spaces when we can talk about this issue, because you can have all the cooperation, international cooperation, finance, but if the government doesn't have accountability in this issue, there is not going to be solved. Also, one of the main problems that we have here is that some government programs offer like some courses from the rural areas, but they don't take in count that we don't have internet connection. So it's something that has to be done in all the spheres, private sector, public sector. We are trying our best, but the challenge is still being huge. So that's the strategy that we are doing. But yeah, as she said, it's a huge challenge, and I hope this government is will to overcome and to work with the private organizations and the foundations that are working in the field. Thank you.
Thank you, Luisa. And of course, the challenges are even bigger when we're talking about vulnerable communities like the Afro communities or the indigenous communities in Colombia that you were mentioning, but talking about even the LGBTQ communities in Kenya, Stephen, when we're talking about education, what is the challenges when we're even talking about education systems and education curriculums that again erase the identity of these communities?
To start with, I'll just give the latest news that you're having. We're having a case of around 4 girls being expelled from school due to perceived lesbian activity. And that in itself gives you just the picture of how our curriculum, our education curriculum is socialized to criminalize authentic queer expression. And of course, even looking at the Kenya Institute of Curriculum Development, it is a board of cultural fundamentalists, people who are traditional in thinking, who are not conventional in reasoning, and what they're giving is the traditional way of education. And of course, we've also seen during the previous political regime where we had the Minister of Education coming out to say that gay students who are openly gay are not supposed to attend boarding schools and are supposed to attend day schools. We are having, even with the new curriculum that was developed, a scenario where even talking about sexuality, including comprehensive sexuality education, is criminalized. And the church is sanitizing to what extent can we even talk about sexuality, even in schools, which then leads to very many children making unhealthy sexual choices that then also affect their academics, their academic performance, and their curriculum proactivity. So this all together, synchronized, comes into a space where we are lacking a space to dialogue so that we can have affirmation in the education curriculum and also an invitation to participate in the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And Jax, I know that you believe in education. You're a teacher, you're a professor, and we know that the panorama, like I said, it's not just our countries, it's just pretty much the challenges for education right now are enormous. But I would like to end this conversation also on why working on education, why working with young people when we're talking about prevention of organized crime, when we're talking about addressing the consequences of violence and organized crime.
Thank you so much. Actually, I believe in education because I know that education makes young people unavailable for recruitments by criminal organizations. Education is the only tool that provides options beyond violence and crime. However, this is not very easy to implement in a conflict area for 3 reasons. Number one, you are in a country whereby the education system is already fragilized because it doesn't receive enough financial support from the government, because the government said that the priority is peace and security. So other sectors like education do not receive enough resources. Therefore, the education system at the national level is already in trouble. Now, those areas, conflict affected areas, are more marginalized because they do not benefit from quality, the least quality education the country can provide, because the best teachers will not go to those conflict affected areas. I know this from experience. I grew up in that particular region. I did my primary school as an IDP, and I could tell the difference between what I got and what other children got when I went to university. So that's also another challenge. Number 3, education provides options. However, in a conflict zone, crime and violence sometimes provide better options in terms of financial returns. For example, we've been working in a mining area whereby those young people who work with criminal organizations in trafficking of minerals can have more money than a salary, a monthly salary of someone. So these people will tell you, why going to school when I know that I can earn enough money from this and that activity? So we are trying to discuss with security actors and other state actors to say crime should not be an option. So even if we are investing in education, we are investing in skills, but we have to make sure that crime is no longer an option that can pay more than formal employment.
Absolutely, thank you. And Robert also agrees that education serves as a preventive measure, and that's pretty much the work you all are doing, and we're seeing positive results on the ground. So I invite you all to check the work of these fellows. But before we finish, we have a couple of minutes, Ana Paula, and since OSI 24 is a space that started actually mainly for academic, to share academic research, and I know that a lot of our audience comes from academia. So I would like to hear your take on the importance of education when we are addressing preventing organized crime violence, when we're addressing the consequences of criminal governance in youth, and how can the academic community support this grassroots effort of activists that we support through the Resilience Fund.
Thank you very much, Syria. I think it's an important question and relates to some of the points that Jacques, Louise, and Stephen were mentioning, and it made me reflect. I think there is a need of awareness raising, a need for an awareness raising exercise in terms of equalizing economic and social and cultural rights to other political and civic rights. So I think, and that comes a lot in terms of responses to organized crime, because we are very much talking about security rights in many spaces, and this end up being more close to civil political rights. So I think there is an area and a need for us to understand better in terms of academic research or policy research on the implications, direct implications to potential violations to economic and social rights, so we can have better data, for example. This is one area that I think relates to the points on how we can address challenges related to better education. I also think that it relates a lot to resource allocation. This is one of the key considerations when we are talking about economic, social, and cultural rights, to fulfilling those rights, how we allocate resources to do so. And I think there is another area that I think potential research could be strengthening on how proceeds of crime could be better utilized to fulfill economic and social needs. In particular, reverting back to communities that were affected by organized crime, and then therefore had the rights violation in that community. So I think that would be 2 points that I would add. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ana Paula. And that is super interesting. And this has been a very good conversation. And I think it will continue, definitely will continue through the fellowship, because these fellows are actually collaborating on how to bring these local conversations on the work they're doing with youth at the global level. So I invite you to keep an eye on them, because they're amazing, and their work is actually going places. And I want to thank you for this wonderful conversation of this truly global panel, from Democratic Republic of Congo to Colombia, Brazil to Kenya, and of course my multinational team. Thank you, Daniela, Alexander, Adrian, Julia, Daniela, I already mentioned you, everybody who was, Maria, everybody who was helping us today to make this panel happen. And thank you to our audience. Thank you for your questions and for your listening. It was a real honor. I think there is no option but to include youth in the conversation, and not only as recipients of help or our attention. I think we must involve youth actually in the designing of the responses. We must involve youth in the designing of the strategies against organized crime, and we must involve youth in raising awareness about organized crime. So that was my my limit of time, my bell has sounded. So I think we only have a few minutes left, and I'm gonna wrap it up. So thank you all very much, and I'll see you next time. Muchas gracias. Merci beaucoup. Obrigado.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Bye.
Asante.